He rescued 2 alien sisters from a deadly snowdrift. Now, in his warm cabin, they called him husband. The wind screamed over the ridgeline, scouring the treetops until they bowed like brittle black reeds against the white void. Snow fell sideways, fine as ground glass, turning the world into a single shifting sheet of cold. Nolan Varick stood at the edge of his porch, collar pulled up against his jaw, watching the forest vanish into a storm that seemed determined to erase even memory of the land beneath it. His cabin squatted at the tree line, timbers dark with years of frost, roofline hunched against the weather. A curl of smoke rose from the chimney and was snatched away before it could rise a full arm's length. Inside, the stove's warmth lingered, the smell of pine pitch clinging to the walls, the kind of heat that settled deep into the bones. He'd planned to stay there for the night, boots drying by the door, but something on the wind had hooked him faint, wrong, not the groan of a loaded branch or the howl of a shifting drift. A softer note, movement muffled under the snow. He hesitated only long enough to pull on his gloves. Instinct had a weight in him, heavier than the cold. He'd heard that sound before, long ago, in places where people didn't always make it back. He stepped into the storm dot. The first bite of the wind clawed through the seams in his coat. Ice scoured his cheeks. Snow swirled thick enough to blot the horizon, leaving only the skeletal silhouettes of trees as markers. He moved through them with the slow, practiced caution of a man who knew every hollow could be a trap. His boots broke through crusted drifts, sinking to the shin. The sound came again, muffled, choked. A pale shape broke the pattern of the snow ahead. At first, he thought it was just a wind-carved mound, but then the surface shifted, revealing a spill of silver hair matted with frost. He dropped to one knee, brushing snow aside with gloved hands until a face emerged sharp-boned, skin a muted violet tinged blue with cold, lips barely parting for shallow breaths. Dark bruises marred the line of her neck. She was taller than most humans, her limbs too long and elegant to be mistaken for one of his own kind. She was alive. Barely Dot, he didn't stop to ask how or why. He hooked his arms under her and heaved her free of the drift. She weighed less than she should have, like the cold had hollowed her out. A flicker of movement caught his eye, a smaller figure curled against a nearby snowbank, half hidden in the storm's shifting curtain. He lowered the first woman to the ground, muttering a curse that the wind tore away, and pushed toward the second. This one was slight, delicate-boned, skin the same alien lilac, her face half buried in the snow. When he pulled her free, heat still clung faintly to her body, but her breathing was uneven. He slung her across his arms, then bent to lift the taller woman again, awkwardly balancing their weight. Every step back to the cabin was a fight. Wind drove needles into his eyes, blurred his vision, pulled at the fragile bodies he carried. His breath came hard and loud in his ears, each exhale turning to ice on the scarf around his mouth. The cabin's dark shape emerged from the white, only to vanish again as the snow closed in. By the time he reached the porch, his legs burned and his arms felt carved from lead. He shouldered the door open and stumbled inside, kicking it shut. Against the storm's fury, heat wrapped around them like a blanket. He knelt by the stove, laying them out on the fur rug, and stripped the ice-crusted scraps of clothing from their bodies with careful, shaking hands. He worked fast, wrapping each in thick wool, setting the smaller one closer to the stove, where the heat could bite deepest. Their breaths were fragile, but they were breaths. He sat back, chest heaving, watching the firelight flicker over faces that had no business being out in the snows of Kirilith 7. He didn't know their names, didn't know what trouble had driven them here, but he knew the look of someone the world had decided to discard. And whatever else this night brought, he would not watch them vanish into the cold. Not again. The The storm pressed against the cabin walls with a low, steady moan, as if trying to seep through every seam. Inside, the stove's iron belly glowed orange, throwing shifting shadows across the timbered walls. Nolan sat on the floorboards, his back against the table leg, watching the two women for signs of movement. The smaller one stirred first. Her head shifted under the blanket, lashes fluttering as she blinked into the dim light. Her eyes were a pale silver, clouded with confusion, but sharp enough to take in the strange man crouched across from her. She clutched the wool tighter, shrinking into its folds. "You're safe," Nolan said quietly. His voice was low and even, the way you'd speak to a spooked animal. "You were in the snow. I brought you in." She didn't answer, but her gaze darted around the cabin stove, table, shelves, door cataloging exits, threats, everything. Then her eyes landed on the other figure beside her, still motionless under a separate blanket. She shifted closer, her small hands fumbling to check the taller woman's breathing. "She's alive," Nolan assured her. "Just cold." The sound of his voice seemed to reach the taller one. A low groan broke from her lips, and her eyes opened slowly, pupils narrowing against the light. Even through exhaustion, there was an edge to her stare wariness, sharpened into something almost defensive. "Who are you?" Her voice was rough, as though every word scraped her throat. "Nolan Varick. I live here," he replied, holding her gaze, but keeping his hands still on his knees. She studied him in silence, then scanned the cabin the same way her companion had, quick, deliberate, measuring. "Why?" she asked at last. He frowned slightly. "Why what? Why help us?" There it was, the suspicion he'd been expecting. He could have lied, could have given a neat answer about morals or principles. Instead, he said the thing that had driven him out into the storm in the first place. "I didn't want you to die out there." Her eyes narrowed, searching his face for something: mockery, hidden cost, the tell of a predator. She found none, but didn't soften either. "Sarin," she said finally, nodding toward herself. "Her name is Karail." The smaller one, Karail, looked up at the sound of her name, her face drawn but her breathing steady. "Here," Nolan said, rising. He crossed to the counter and ladled steaming broth from the pot he'd kept simmering over the fire. He set 2 bowls on the floor in front of them, then stepped back. Karail reached for hers quickly, cupping it in both hands. Saran waited a beat longer, watching him as though expecting him to snatch it away. Only when he stayed where he was did she take the bowl. She tested the heat with her fingertips before bringing it to her lips. Nolan eased himself into his chair, near the stove, letting them eat without further words. A fire popped and hissed, filling the room with the scent of wood smoke and boiled grain. When Karail set her empty bowl aside, she spoke in a voice small but steady. "Can we stay? Just for a while?" Nolan glanced at Sarin. She was still watching him, jaw tight, but there was no denial in her eyes, only the weight of someone refusing to hope. "As long as you need," he said. Carol's shoulders eased, just a fraction. Sarin gave no sign at all, but she didn't argue. For now, in this cabin on the edge of the frozen forest, that was enough. The days that followed bled together in shades of gray and white, the storm outside easing, but never quite relenting. The cabin became its own small world, wood, stone, and firelight holding back the endless cold. Nolan kept busy the way he always had, splitting logs on the porch, patching leaks in the roof slats, checking the perimeter for tracks that never came. Only now, when he came back inside, he wasn't stepping into silence. Karail had claimed a corner near the stove, where the light was warmest. She sat with her legs folded under her, mending and stitching whatever scraps she could find in his. Storage crates, old thermal linings, worn survey shirts, even a torn wool scarf. Her stitches were uneven at first, but they held. She hummed sometimes under her breath, a tune Nolan didn't recognize. Soft enough not to draw her sister's attention, Saren moved differently. She never sat for long, always scanning, listening. She kept to the edges of the room, standing at the window or leaning against the doorframe with her arms folded. Yet when Nolan returned from outside with an armful of wood, she was there without being asked, taking half a load and stacking it by the stove. She said little, but her eyes no longer carried the immediate calculation of escape. One morning, Nolan found Kirilith scratching lines into the wood wall beside the hearth with a stub of chalk. He paused, watching her shape each letter with careful pressure. "What's that?" he asked. "A list," she said, without looking up. "Things we might need when the snow breaks." He stepped closer. The first word was soap, written in shaky script. Beneath it, fabric, stronger boots, blue thread. Saren emerged from the bedroom, catching the sight of it. She stepped closer, eyes narrowing, and then unexpectedly said, "Add curtains." Kirilith glanced at her sister, grinned faintly, and wrote it down. The act was small, but it made something shift in Nolan's chest. These two weren't just passing through. They were shaping the space, claiming it. Later that day, Saren announced she was going outside. Nolan moved to stand, but she shook her head. "I'll just be on the ridge. Need to see it for myself." When she returned an hour later, she carried a half-frozen sack of roots and moss, her gloves dusted with ice. "Under the drifts," she said, dropping the bundle on the table. "Still some life left if you know where to dig." That night, the three of them ate stew thicker than any Nolan had managed alone. Bitter moss softened by the heat, roots breaking apart in the broth. They ate without hurry, the sound of their spoons and the hiss of the stove filling the air. After the bowls were empty, Kirilith leaned against him on the bench, her hair brushing his sleeve. Saren sat across from them, arms loose on the table, watching but not with the same wary tension as before. The fire popped. Snow whispered against the window. For the first time since it built the cabin, Nolan realized the space didn't feel too big or too small. It felt right. And though no one said it aloud, the unspoken truth hung in the air between them. They weren't just surviving together. They were beginning to belong. The storm broke in the middle of the night, leaving the world outside still and muffled under a fresh blanket of snow. Moonlight spilled pale and cold through the frosted window panes, painting soft shapes across the cabin floor. Nolan stirred awake to the sound of movement, bare feet brushing the boards. A pause at his door. He sat up, expecting Saren's silhouette in the doorway, but it was Kirilith. She stood there wrapped in one of the makeshift robes she'd sewn. From his spare blankets, a hem trailing over the floor, her hands gathered at her front. Her voice was quiet, almost shy. "I couldn't sleep." He shifted aside without thinking, making room. She crossed the small space and curled onto the far edge of the bed, facing away, but close enough he could hear the small, steady breaths she drew in. "You're safe here," he said. She didn't answer right away. Then, in a low voice, "Do you think Saren will ever stop looking at you like she's waiting for you to hurt us?" "She has every reason to be cautious," he said, "but she's wrong about that part." Kirilith was silent for a moment. Then, "I think I'm tired of being afraid." He didn't reach for her, didn't close the gap, just sat beside her until her breathing slowed and she drifted into sleep. When he glanced toward the doorway, he saw Saren standing in the shadows. She didn't speak, didn't step in. But she didn't turn away either. The days that followed came brighter and colder. The sky cleared enough for sunlight to catch on the icebound branches, scattering pale light through the cabin windows. Nolan rebuilt the bed frame with wider slats, working in the yard with scrap beams and salvaged bolts. He told himself it was for comfort, for the nights when Carol's thin frame leaned into his side for warmth. But when he brought it inside, he glanced at Sarin too, and didn't hide at Dot. It was late afternoon when Sarin finally approached him without a pretext. She stood at the table, one hand braced on the edge, her gaze fixed on him. "Don't expect this to mean I trust you," she said. "I don't," he replied, "but I wouldn't be here if you were like the others." He nodded once. "That's enough." The moment passed without ceremony. She moved to help Kirill hang the last of the curtains across the frost-streaked windows. It was only days later, in the lull of a golden winter morning, that the shift came. Nolan was at the stove, pouring tea, when the sisters came toward him to gather Kirill first, Sarene a half-step behind. "We're not cold," Kirill said, her silver eyes catching the light. "We're not afraid. That's the difference." Sarene's hand settled on his shoulder. They moved as though the choice had already been made, as though the weeks of guarded glances and measured silences had all been leading here. There was no hurry, no desperation, only the quiet, deliberate certainty of three people who had decided, each in their own way, that whatever waited beyond the tree line could wait forever. And when Nolan let them draw him in, it wasn't out of loneliness. It was because, for the first time since he'd stepped onto this frozen world, he understood what it meant to be chosen. The cold loosened its grip in small, almost invisible ways. Snow still lay thick across the ridge, but the wind no longer rattled the cabin at night, and the light through the eastern windows lingered a little longer each morning. Inside, the air felt different, warmer, fuller, thick with the sense of wood smoke, boiled roots, and the faint tongue of soap Sarene had found in one of Nolan's storage crates. Kirill was the one who said it first. She sat cross-legged on the rug near the stove, a half-finished tunic in her lap, stitching neat rows with the blue thread Nolan had found tucked away in an old survey kit. "We should name this place," she said, her needle pausing mid-her. Nolan, sitting at the table, glanced up from the tools he was cleaning. "It's just a cabin." "It's our cabin," she said, without looking at him. "And things that belong to people have names." Sarene, sitting near the window with her coat draped over her chair, tilted her head slightly. "What would you call it?" Kirill looked toward the frost-traced glass, the snow beyond, the drift's end. Sarene considered it, eyes narrowing faintly, then nodded. "It fits." Nolan said nothing at first, just let the words settle in. He pictured the cabin on a map, a single point marked far from anything else, with that name written beside it. It didn't feel like an exaggeration. Finally, he gave a quiet breath. "It fits," he agreed. The next morning, Sarene appeared from the shed behind the cabin with 3 small copper rings in her palm rough, uneven, each one shaped from stripped wire. She didn't explain as she handed one to Kirill, then to Nolan. The metal was cool in his fingers, but steady. Kirill smiled, slipping hers onto her thumb. Nolan turned his over once before sliding it onto his finger. No one called it a promise, but it felt like one. Over the next few days, the cabin transformed. The crates that had served as shelves were replaced with proper boards Sarene cut and fitted herself, salvaged from old roof beams Nolan had been hoarding. Carol's curtains now hung in every window, thick enough to keep the cold from creeping in, but loose enough to let in the pale light. Nolan repaired the outer door hinge, fixed the leaky panel over the stove, and lined the porch with flat stones so the snow could be swept away more easily. One afternoon, he found Kirill in the yard, her hands buried in the snow near the back wall. At first he thought she was digging for firewood he'd stored, but when he stepped closer, he saw the dark patch of earth she had uncovered beneath the ice. Her face was flushed from the cold, but her eyes were bright. "I want something to grow here," she said. He didn't ask what, just fetched the tools. Together, The three of them cleared a rectangle, lined it with smooth stones, and covered it again for the thaw. Kirilith called it their proof. Proof they'd stayed. Proof they'd made something. That night, they cooked real meat from Nolan's last deep cache store. They ate by firelight, the copper rings catching the glow. No one mentioned the storms, or the drone hum they'd once heard, or the fact that nothing on Kirilith 7 stayed safe forever. For now, the world outside could be as cold and empty as it wanted. Inside, the drift's end was full, and when they turned in for the night, the widened bed frame fit them without crowding, the blankets holding their shared warmth. There was no awkwardness anymore, no hesitations, just the quiet certainty that this was theirs chosen, claimed, and not easily given up. The thaw never came all at once on Kirilith 7. It crept in slowly, the kind of change you had to notice in shadows and in the way snow crusted thinner on the porch rails. On the 6th morning after the naming, Nolan stepped outside with the axe and saw it, faint grooves in the snow beyond the first line of trees. Not boot prints, not animal tracks parallel runners, narrow and sharp, armored sled marks. He crouched at the edge of the drift, brushing back the top layer until the packed lines showed clear. They were old enough to have taken frost, but not more than a day or two. They led in from the northwest ridge and angled back out toward the frozen river, vanishing where the terrain dipped. When he came back inside, Saren was standing by the stove, rolling the sleeves of the surveyor's coat he'd given her. She looked at his face once, then at the door. "You saw them," she said, not as a question. He nodded. "Not scavenger drones. This was sled gear, heavy, syndicate style." Her jaw set. "If they're here, they're not looking for salvage." Kirilith, sitting on the bench with a folded length of cloth in her lap, looked between them. "You mean they're looking for us?" Saren finished, her voice flat but not shaken. Nolan leaned against the table, arms crossed. "Could be they passed through. Could be they didn't know you were here." Saren's gaze locked to his. "And if they did?" He didn't answer right away. Then we don't run. This is our ground now." Carol's fingers tightened on the cloth. "Then we stay together." Something passed between the three of them in the silence that followed. Not a plan, not even a promise, but an understanding got the rest of the day. The cabin felt quieter, though not from fear. Saren checked the ridge twice, returning without a word each time. Kirilith worked at her sewing, though her eyes flicked to the window more than once. Nolan kept the axe near the door. The tracks never came closer, but he could feel them out there. In his mind, like a distant hum under the snow. That night, the fire was banked low, candles flickering on the table. The copper rings glinted in the light as Kirilith reached across to take his hand, her touch light but deliberate. Saren sat opposite, her eyes steady. "Husband," she said, the word landing between them like it had always been there. Not soft, not shy a declaration. Nolan didn't correct her. Later, when the lamps were out and the three of them lay beneath the same blankets, there was no space between their bodies. Carol's breath warmed his chest. Saren's arm rested heavy across his ribs. Outside, snow sifted down, covering the ridge, the river, the tracks dot in the dark. He closed his eyes to the sound of their breathing and thought of the patch of earth behind the cabin, waiting under the frost. When spring came, and it would, even here something would grow there. Whatever came looking for them would find more than two discarded sisters and a man who'd once lived alone. They would find Drift's End and the people who had chosen to make it home.